Hi everybody, Bearded Rogue here, today with another after-action analysis of a game that I playtested at Dragonflight. This time specifically Kingrobo. So, for those who don't know, Kingrobo is a game that I created that is kind of a combination of the King Domino drafting style system and my much larger game Back to Earth. Back to Earth is one of my earlier designs. It is currently signed with TMG, and I am very, very happy with it. However, I have a couple of major weaknesses as a designer that I personally am trying to address in my current round of designs. One of them is cognitive overload. I am very, very good at overwhelming people at the table. This is a thing that I touched on a little bit in yesterday's video about the after-action analysis for Warm Fuzzies. Needless to say, it's something that has existed in nearly all of my designs. Cognitive overload is something that I am very good at producing, or at least very reliable in producing. And so I wanted to try to streamline some of my games down, strip them down, and see how they worked. And I figured I would start with mechanisms that I already knew because I had designed games using them. And Kingrobo is kind of the first of those. So the big thing about Kingrobo is that I'm using the King Domino draft in place of a monetary economy. So there's no spending of money to acquire new cards for your engine. Instead, you are drafting cards for your engine. It is fairly standard in that all the cards will have a number on the back, and you will lay out a number of cards, one more than the number of players. We'll get to that in a second. In numerical order, and then flip them over, and then players will draft them. Obviously, things with higher numbers are more inherently powerful than things with lower numbers on the back. So, in this case, trade in 1 energy for plastic, or just gain 2 energy. These are both cards from age 1, which is the little number here. So that's kind of the idea of the game inherently, is you draft these cards and then you add them to your engine. And what I mean by engine is it's using the assembly line mechanism from my Back to Earth game. So what'll happen is basically you will draft a new card, you will add it to the front of your engine, and then you will trigger it, the next card, and the next card in sequence. So I would gain 2 energy, spend 1 energy on a plastic, spend 1 energy on a plastic and a steel. And then this card would fall off to a discard pile. These cards would slot over and leave me with a new spot for a new card to take the first card's place. So after every draft, you basically add the card to your 3-card display and then run your engine. When you run your engine, you gain all of your resources, and you mark them on this handy-dandy little tracking sheet. There are tracking cubes that go in each row. Think of them as 10s and 1s for each resource. And so you move the cubes to adjust your resources as you go. And each round basically plays like that. Draft your next card, take the card that you just removed your pawn from, add it to your engine, run your engine, change your resources as necessary. This skeleton of a design has been around since the very beginning of Kingrobo's creation and was very much exactly what I was looking to do as far as the core action of the gameplay. Some of the things have changed around a bit. One of them is cards being divided into ages, so that there aren't cards in the draft that you cannot use. You start the game simply with energy, so cards that give you energy or cards that allow you to spend energy are what is in age 1. By age 2, you now have steel and plastic, and you can use your steel and plastic to make robots. Again, gaining energy is something you can do in every phase. Some of the cards in here are tech cards, and I'll get into what those do in a second. But all of the things here gain energy, or let you spend steel or plastic or gain energy to continue running your engine. And then last but not least is Age 3, wherein you are now spending robots to build factories and or habitats. There's also still some cards that allow you to spend energy, but the majority of the cards are all about either gaining lots of robots for plastic or steel, gaining lots of resources for energy, or converting robots into habitats and factories, which are basically the top of the tech tree in the game. So each of the three phases has its own characteristic, as it were. The next thing, so that's kind of where it's been for a while, with the 3 ages of cards and the draft into running your assembly line and then moving on from there. So there were 2 things that I specifically wanted to get out of playtesting this weekend. One is I was pretty sure that scoring was terrible. Now, I said that cognitive overload is one of the things that I as a designer need to work on in my designs. The other thing I need to work on in my designs is scoring and endgame conditions. I am notoriously bad at both of these things. And I'm not saying this is a self-deprecating thing. I'm saying this is, I am self-aware enough to realize that this is a problem that I have as a designer that I need to work on and figure out. This is something I need to work through. Much like I would work through an issue in one of my game designs, I'm going to do this by iteration. I'm going to, play around with things and try and figure it out as time goes on. Looking at how other games score, looking at how my designs and their current scoring systems work, that sort of thing. So, I highlighted the action abilities of the cards earlier, but one of the things I didn't highlight is the scoring of the cards. So this is a issue that I have had inside of the game, is that this is basically Concordia scoring, except with a lot more cards, which makes it not workable. And I'll explain why in a minute. But this basically says that for every 3 plastic, I get 1 victory point. That's great! This card goes into my discard pile at the end of my assembly line, and at the end of the game, I can use this to score points for having plastic. This card also scores me for having 3 plastic. So now, with both of them in my discard pile, I score 2 points for every 3 plastic. Do you see where this is going? That's right, it's a multiplicative scoring system in a game where you are going to have a crap ton of cards in your discard pile. So, the other thing I wanted to test, other than just the scoring in general, was the 2-player game. And so my initial concept for the 2-player game was that instead of stripping down cards from the decks or trying to figure out a way to make a draft interesting for 2 players, is that you would each control 2 pawns. So you would basically draft 2 cards around. And each time you added a card to your engine, you would, trigger your abilities and gain all your resources. What this means is that in a 2-player game, you're gaining twice as many resources as in a 4-player game. This becomes a problem when you factor in multiplicative scoring, which ends up in something that looks like this. So I already knew that scoring was a problem to the point where myself, with the help of Daniel Newman, had a score sheet made. This is the score sheet for that 2-player game. As you can see at the bottom, 347 to 425. That's right, scores were astronomical. Scores were so astronomical that the score sheet that we had made to help us keep track of everything, I messed up in multiple points trying to figure out exactly what algebraic formula I needed to use in order to actually score the damn game. So basically the way it works is you look at how many resources you have, and then you compare it to the ratio. So let's say I have 8 plastic. That means that I divide that by 3, meaning that each one of these cards is now 2 points. I don't get a full 3 points because I don't have 9 and we round down. But I do get 2 points per card. Then I have to multiply that by every card in my discard pile that scores plastic. So 2 of these at 2 points each would be 4. Seems pretty simple until we start getting to some of the more involved scoring. For example, robots at 1. If I have 15 robots, and this is in my discard pile, it scores 15 points. If I have 5 of these in my discard pile, it scores 75 points. If I have 12 robots, and each one of, or if I have, 15 robots, and I have 15 of these in my discard pile, as you can see, the math gets wonky really, really quick. So in a 2-player game, the way I was doing it, everybody's gaining twice as many cards, which makes the multiplicative aspects of it even worse. Everybody's also running twice as many cards through their assembly line, again, making the multiplicative factors even worse. Now, the game itself, as is, the mechanisms, the action of the game, played perfectly. It's very well tuned. People who've played the game love the engine building, resource conversion aspects of it. I haven't gotten any complaints about how the game works in that regard. However, nobody, including myself, wants to play a game that feels very satisfying and then have to do algebra to figure out who won, or even how they did, let alone whether they won or not. Very, very much not intuitive and not a great way to do things. So, how do we change that? Well, there's a couple of things that I'm thinking about that could make a difference. One of the first things that I'm thinking about is basically removing the scoring from the bottom of the card. So that if the scoring isn't present at the bottom of the card, you instead just score based on ratios. So you're earning resources, and then at the end of the game, those same ratios, 3 plastic equals 1 victory point, carry through. So if you have 9 plastic at the end of the game, you get 3 points. And that's it. There's no multiplication across the cards. It's just, that's what plastic is worth. Would that feel satisfying? I don't know. One of the reasons these scoring aspects are on the bottom of these cards is to make drafting more interesting. Because if I have something like, for example, this energy card, which scores for plastic, the energy itself is agnostic. I can use it to power anything I want. I can generate plastic or steel with this, no problem. But the fact that it scores for plastic may play into why I would draft this one versus a different one. Just as an example, if I already have a ton of plastic, choosing something that scores plastic is a pretty good idea. Or if I intend to move in the plastic direction, if I'm intending to go plastic, then getting something that scores for plastic is more beneficial to me in the long term. So those are things that that was one idea that I had, but I'm worried that it will make the draft a lot less interesting. Secondly, my thought is to instead leave the ratios on the bottom of the cards. However, make it so that when you take a card, when you draft a card, you choose to either run it through the engine using its action ability, or you run it through its engine gaining nothing, but when it falls off it goes to your score pile. So you now have a decision to make with every card. Are you going to try to take advantage of the actions, or, and I'll probably flip it the other direction, are you going to score using this card? That might still be an interesting decision, and not cause the math to balloon. So I may take a card that scores plastic, and then run it through my engine, gaining no benefit from it other than at the end of the game, for all the plastic I have, I will now score points. This may be something that is interesting and or useful, and maybe a direction to go that will keep the math from ballooning out of order. Basically, only cards that are in your discard pile will, or in your score pile, will score, meaning that you won't necessarily score for everything, and you may not have a lot of cards in your score pile that score, but you're choosing what you score, just as an example of one way to do it. Another thing that I have in the game right now to make drafting more interesting are tech cards. I mentioned them a little bit earlier. So, when you are dealing out cards for drafting, you deal out a number of age cards of each age equal to the number of players. So you deal out, in a 4-player game, 4 level 1 or age 1 cards. Then you would flip over the top tech card from age 1 and add it to the end of the row. Now, why the end? Well, first of all, it's a more powerful ability. You may have noticed that in all of the other cards, you spend energy to get steel. This one just gives you steel. You may also know that the ratio is doubled here. Instead of 3 steel for 1 victory point, it's 3 steel for equal 2 victory points. It also is usable as 2 energy when you run it through your engine without using the gain steel ability. You would never do that, but every card has to have something that you can do with it if you cannot afford to execute its primary action. For example, if you run out of energy and something costs energy, it's real feel bad to not be able to actually do what is on your card. There are also some tech cards that have fancier abilities, like letting you pull things out of the discard pile and run them through your engine again. That sort of thing. There's tech cards for each age, and you don't use all of them in a game. You don't use all of the cards from any age in a game either. You only use part of them. And that's where the interesting bits come in. Could tech cards be scorecards? Could that be what you're drafting? Or what the tech cards do? Are they the cards that let you score for things, and all of the other cards are simply actions? Or vice versa, are tech cards the super nifty ability cards, like, for example, replay a card from the discard pile and then attach this card and it produces a robot as it rides through your assembly line? Is that the answer instead? To do something along those lines, keep the tech cards as super powerful abilities and completely divorce them from scoring? I don't know. I don't know yet. I'm going to have to try a couple of different things and iterate in order to figure it out. Right now, the direction I'm leaning is into cards being scoreable or actionable. Meaning you choose when you add it to your assembly line whether it's going to your score pile or your discard pile. And then perhaps this ability right here in the top corner, that is the consolidation or consolation ability, for having a card that you may not be able to use. For example, if you don't have any energy, you can't make plastic, but you could instead gain an energy. Perhaps the consolation ability is what will be used when you're scoring, so that it still does something in your engine. And then maybe I can get rid of some of the starter cards in the engines that just produce energy, so that everybody has enough energy to do things. I don't know. I don't know yet. There's a lot of ideas on the table and a lot of ways to make it work, but all of it is going to involve stripping out multiplicative scoring one way or another. Another thing that I've been interested in adding to the game are goal cards, basically missions to complete. For example, the first one to 3 factories and 3 habitats, or the first one to 6 plastic and 6 steel, the first one to 6 factories, first one to 9 plastic robots, the first one to 12 plastic. You get the picture. Basically just having goal cards off to the side that also are a way that you score points. This may be another way wherein I could have the game score. Perhaps you score via goal cards, or you complete shipments of some sort, or you complete work orders. I don't know. Recipe completion is a good way to get rid of resources and a good way to give people points. I have the way that they gain resources. The trick is how do they convert those resources into points? Is just hoarding them, and then at the end of the game you get a certain amount of points for it, the way I want to go? Or do I want it to be more dynamic and have people spending the resources that they're producing in order to gain points? Again, I don't know. I think the goal cards being in the game is a good idea regardless, simply because it gives people something to move towards. If, for example, the first to 9 plastic robots card is out on the field, there's a pretty good reason to build plastic robots. Go get points. These use the same ratios or slightly better ratios than what was in the standard. No, they're the same ratios as the standard cards, but it's basically like adding an additional scorecard to your pile for that. And maybe that's the way that I introduce what people score for in the game. I don't know. I don't know yet exactly what it's going to look like. I just know that the current nature of scoring, the Concordia scoring where every card gives you points, does not work in this context. Concordia scoring works because there is a much smaller deck of cards, and because a lot of them are just checks, like, do you have X, Y, or Z, rather than counting up resources and then multiplying them. So that's an important distinction to keep in mind. Regardless, Kingrobo is pretty healthy. The game plays really, really smoothly. There's no hiccups in how the game plays. The only hiccups are in how the game scores. And some of the game that currently plays just fine is going to have to change to accommodate a new scoring system. I'm A-okay with that. When I sat down, I expected that there was going to be a problem with scoring, based on previous playtests. Having it completely confirmed means that, well, one, I may know a little bit more about this than I think I do, and two, that sometimes getting it to the table is the best way to prove a point. It's experimentation. I had a hypothesis that scoring was going to be out of control. Putting it on the table is how I verified that. Now, could I have run solo playtests and simulated it? Probably. Could I have sat at home by myself and run spreadsheets and figured out, oh wow, this is going to be way too much? Probably. But I wanted to know how the rest of the game worked too, because whatever scoring method I eventually decide upon is going to have to work with all of that, and be integrated with all of that. And I needed to know if there was anything about it that didn't work or that I needed to fix in the meantime. So I got a lot of data. It was a very good playtest, with a very gracious playtester. I'm really happy with how it went, even though it was good, colossal failure. It was what I was expecting and what I was hoping for out of the playtest, and so I'm really glad that I got an opportunity to get it to the table. Now it's time to take it back to the drawing board and figure out what direction for scoring I want to try first. Once I get that, it'll be time to get it back to the table and figure out yet again whether or not I can get over this hurdle of how do I score or how do I end my games. It can't be an activity that just goes on perpetually. Nobody's going to do that, no matter how interesting the mechanisms are, or even the theme. This one obviously needs to be rethemed. I'm not sure exactly what that's going to be. Maybe that will help me inform my scoring. But I'm really happy with where this game's at right now, and I'm going to be even happier once I get a chance to work on it and see where it goes from here. So, that's it. After action analysis of my playtest of Kingrobo. We'll, be back with more news on this game at some other point in the future, I'm sure. Anyway, that's it for today. Later.